name is Keith Haus, and I will be the moderator for this show. And first off, let's introduce ourselves and our expertise on this study. This is the COVID-19 review. I forget the exact term that we were using, but it's okay. We're going to be talking about COVID-19 and kind of the scientific assessment of it, and then how people have responded to it. So my name is Keith Haus. I'm an anthropologist and a historian. I tend to study intercultural history and video game history. And I'm actually from Portland and Seattle, so yay! Okay, let's go over to Eric then.
My name's Eric Swedin. I'm a professor of history at Weber State University. My specialties include the history of science, and the whole COVID-19 thing was very interesting to watch because I've read about these type of things in the past, and it was interesting to watch it unfold in almost quite frankly, a completely predictable way. And that is someone calling me on my cell phone. Move on to the next person.
Okay.
I will go.
Go ahead.
I'm Donna Milakovic. I'm the Senior Director of Community Outreach at Utah Valley University. I am also a native of New York. I was actually visiting family in upstate New York in late February of last year, and so was able to see just before the pandemic hit, and have some personal experiences with coming back. And the debriefing is a little bit about that humanity of what COVID-19 has done for all of our lives. I also work at a large institution where 40,000 students were affected by the shutdown of universities, and followed closely what the response was and kind of living science in real time. So excited to talk about it today.
All right. And our last panelist.
I'm Jan Campanelli. I'm a writer. I write primarily romance with a side of horror parody. I focus on people and relationships, and I'm kind of not sure why they put me on this panel, but I'm going to do my best. I was actually working in a call center when COVID blew up, and this call center was providing captioning service for hard of hearing people, which is the majority of the at-risk population. And so every call was about COVID. So I got to see responses on all ends of the spectrum, whether or not people believed it was real, whether or not they were out there buying toilet paper in mass or groceries. So I got to see a big personal one-on-one without, them knowing I was ever there, because most of them thought I was a robot.
Okay. So the thing about COVID-19, and I've found it absolutely fascinating, was we got to watch science happen in real time. For those who don't know what a novel virus is, it means it's so new that even the experts are kind of going, oh. So we got to see people kind of figure things out as fast as they could. What was some of the first things that they were able to figure out?
I think, well, if I might answer, I think that the way different countries reacted very much was exactly based on their remembered history. And Americans have no remembered history of infectious diseases. They are completely oblivious to the idea that infectious diseases happen because they live in a medical paradise. Now you may think, oh no, we don't. No, we have no memory of it. You have so few people that actually know someone who had ever died of an infectious disease, or what we used to call childhood diseases. And so America, in some cases, people that paid attention to what the doctors were saying reacted somewhat better. Others, they acted like spoiled children. I mean, I'm going to just be blunt. It was spoiled children. You look at Taiwan. Now, Taiwan had been hit by SARS about 20 years ago, and it had hit them hard, and they reacted with a plan, with rigor, because for the politicians and for the people, influencers or people who people were looking up to for advice, they remembered what had happened back then. And China, after going through the completely predictable deny that something's happening, because anything that happens bad reflects poorly on the government. They had some remembered experience and they finally dropped into it. You look at African countries and you're looking at African countries going like, these people have next to nothing in terms of healthcare infrastructure, but they are used to fighting infectious diseases and they are used to communicating about it. And they have a population that has remembered experiences and believes in quarantine, believes in invisible things hurting them. Because in the end, that's what it was. And even so, the one last thing I'll point on before I monopolize too much. If you go back and read it about the 2018-2019 flu epidemic, what is fascinating is to read newspaper accounts in which people in big cities are mad because they're being expected to wear masks. And they are having tantrums over it. And the cities are, in some cases, saying, okay, we won't do masks. And then they have an enormous outbreak. In other ones, they say, well, we do have masks, and they don't. Now, and you're going like, but that was a really bad disease. Okay, the disease we have today, COVID-19, is as bad as the disease back there. But back then, you didn't have antibiotics. You didn't have ventilators. You didn't have a sophisticated medical structure. There were a lot of things that gave 500,000 dead back then, and we're going to have 500,000 dead here. But we're going to have 3 times the population for our 500,000 dead. And the reason that we have such a low percentage is because we have such great medical care.
Okay.
So I forgot one of my credentials as well. I sit on the regional board for the American Red Cross, the chapter that covers all of central and southern Utah into Nevada and Arizona. And the question is really, what did the scientists identify early? One, they identified that it was a coronavirus, that it was in that family. They identified some of the general symptoms that we had, but there were so many weird symptoms that came with this coronavirus. I mean, the loss of taste, the loss of smell, does a fever count, does a fever not count? And so at the beginning, if you'll remember, there was, don't worry if it's a low grade fever, and then it was all about fever, and it's a dry cough, not a wet cough. And then they got corona toes, where people were starting to get discoloration and lack of circulation to their toes. So over time, we learned all of these different things, but not until people really started to get sick in places where we could study their symptoms and share information between doctors and share information between universities and researchers in controlled situations. So the Red Cross, suddenly when everything shuts down, blood drives are harder to have. We had emergency issues. We had a big dip in blood drives. And one of the responses, just as scientists are kind of going with some of the things that scientists learn, one of the responses was the need for COVID plasma, people that had already had COVID, and a lot of research on does the plasma help or not, are there plasma research. So now we are collecting COVID patient recovered plasma to help those in vulnerable situations. And back in, I'm not going to get the date right, but it was August or September, everybody who donates blood to the American Red Cross can get an antibodies test for free. So they test the antibodies of the blood when you do a blood donation. And so there was a lot of scrambling from some of our infrastructure for how we respond to emergencies. Organizations like that had to learn as much as they could and stay as up to date as possible on how to keep people safe and yet still do those life-saving things.
Yeah. So when I was working in the call center, we got COVID calls all day long. And the interesting thing was there's a lot of different reactions. There were the people that didn't believe it was real. There were the people that believe, oh, this is all so-and-so's fault. I'm going to tiptoe very carefully around this landmine. And some people were panic buying. Some people were going on with their lives as if nothing had happened. But the one of the core reactions was it was used as a weapon. So whatever side of anything, any political spectrum that people were on, they were either attacking the politicians who were creating policies, or they were attacking the general public for their reaction, or anyone was using it to further their own beliefs and agenda. So when you're world building and looking at introducing a pandemic or the history of a pandemic, it's not just the disease, as we've seen, it's the response to the disease and people's both informed and uninformed influence on the general culture and the response.
Just one more thing on that too. Sorry, Keith. One of the things about being at the Red Cross is you were talking about this remembered history. Early on at one of our board meetings, our local director pulled up a picture from 1917 and the American Cross, 1918, and the American Red Cross was frantically sewing masks. And it was this article about how the Red Cross volunteers were all sewing masks, and there were mask mandates at the time. And I honestly at the time felt like we had kind of lost our minds a little bit with the animosity around wearing masks, and just how angry people were getting. The interesting thing in reading more of the history was that there were protests in the early 1900s during the Spanish flu epidemic. People didn't want to wear masks, and they didn't want to have to wear a mask all day while they were working and doing other things, and they didn't know if it helped. And so there is some remembered history in our longer organizations. Some of our old universities, some of our organizations like the Red Cross, who were on the front lines 100 years ago when this happened, were also on the front lines this time when it happened. And so it gave me a little context as a person, but we've kind of strayed from the science, but I just thought that was really interesting to see the black and white photos of all the handmade masks back in the early 1900s.
It's okay. History is part of science. We get to see how others responded to it, and then how we're going to respond to it. I think Eric brought up an interesting question or interesting point where he said that a lot of the people were doing what they were going to do anyway. And I think a lot of you were kind of mentioning that as well. So what were some of the things that people were just going to do anyway and then say, well, this is protecting you?
Well, definitely, everyone going and buying toilet paper. That was fascinating. I was thinking, but then again, when people tell me about the stuff that they accumulate because they're preppers or they have some prepper instinct, I'm going like, you guys actually haven't thought through these scenarios about what really matters, do you? My in-laws were serious preppers, and I would look at what they had assembled and I'm going like, they don't understand what a true breakdown of society is. That is not useful. Toilet paper is not a major concern. Now, I think many of you are going like, what do you mean? I'm like, that's what scriptures are for. That, if only because they have.
You may want to be really careful with what you just said.
That's what, because it's
all kinds of paper products can substitute.
So anyway,
Sewage safety, Eric.
It was fascinating to see what happened, and in my house, we actually ran out of toilet paper. It was one of those weird things that we did, and so what did we do? We mentioned it to the bishop, and there was a stack of toilet paper left at our front door, like within hours. And
interestingly, I think social media had a ton to do with whether it was water, toilet paper, napkins, right, cleaning supplies. Like we went through a gamut of different things that were available and then not available as people rushed out. And really the shocking thing is how quickly those things happen. I was traveling in New York, visiting family. Actually, my stepfather was very sick and hospitalized. So I was in a hospital with my stepfather and my mom for 9 days leading up to March 4th. So late February, early March. I came home and decided to go shopping because I'd heard some rumors. I'd been in a hospital for several days and I was like, if anything happens or I get sick or I can't go shopping or whatever. And I ended up like in that crazy rush of people. And I spent more money than I have at Costco in my entire life in one time. And everybody laughed. My mom laughed at me. And seriously, though, then we weren't able to go shopping for a month. And it was a good thing that I had gone shopping and I had stocked up on Oreos in the cold storage because when the world ends, I'm going to have Oreos in my cold storage. I'm just saying, because you don't want to be sick and not have chocolate. I did get sick 4 days later. And I was very concerned because I had been traveling in a high-risk zone. New York was just shutting down. Nobody knew what was really happening. I work at a university. And when I tallied the people that I had seen in the 4 days that I worked before I got sick from coming home from New York, it was 100 people I had shaken hands with or talked to or been around. I had seen 100 people and I felt like Typhoid Mary. So, but it's really interesting. The social media aspect is that I started to hear that things were going short. So I went out and went shopping and everybody in the world did the same thing. Everybody in the United States did the same thing. And then there were rumors that toilet paper was made in China and that China was closing down and we wouldn't have any toilet paper. And so the deficit and scarcity mentality that hit so quickly, I think is augmented by the way we communicate now and how connected we are. And vetting through, the hardest part about this was vetting through what was real. Where's toilet paper really made? Are we really going to run out of it? Those kinds of things.
When you mentioned that information spread and the trend, the panic buying, what am I looking for? Rolling like a snowball. Words are hard. That just made me think of masks and gloves. So obviously, when the pandemic started, people were all concerned and started wearing masks. And that wasn't something that the CDC started. That was something old people started when they went to the grocery store. And they also started wearing gloves. I find it interesting that masks stuck and gloves didn't.
This is my explanation for that, because I observed the same thing. And what I observed is quite quickly, people they saw the disease as a contamination. And when you think of it as a contamination, you get preoccupied with purity and cleanliness. And even today, if I go to a library, there they are wiping down all their surfaces. And I'm thinking to myself, that's pandemic theater. That's showing that you're doing something about the pandemic, even though now that we've had enough scientific studies and that we realize that it's really, really, really hard to pass it through surfaces. It's really about the breath.
Isn't there something to be said, though, for helping people feel comfortable coming into a space or into a restaurant? I mean, if I went into a restaurant and they weren't wiping things down, I know it's theater, but it also makes me feel a little safer.
No, actually from the field, it is important and it is very useful. And I'll give you a perfect example. After 9/11, no one would fly. No one would fly. And so what they did is they activated the National Guard and sent the National Guard. So you had uniformed men with machine guns walking around. And now people felt safe with flying. If you had thought for a moment about the actual mechanics of the risk, men in machine guns in no way prevents 9/11. What it does is it creates a sense of security theater and comfort, and people start to live again.
I've noticed
the
that
TSA serves the exact same purpose. Oh, sorry, Keith.
Go ahead. I was going to say the same thing. The TSA is very much so a theater. We don't go into the airports. I was going to say the same thing as Eric just said. we don't go into airports unless we know it's safe. And it's actually kind of hilarious sometimes because we feel safer when we see that people are being searched randomly, especially people that don't need to be searched at all. Like that grandma in the wheelchair, oh, she's being searched. You feel awful. And then you're like, oh, I feel so much safer though. And more people want to fly.
Hey, that's where I'd put a bomb. No, seriously, that is a perfect place to put a bomb.
It's a great place to hide. So much metal and you get through.
That's right. It has to be physically searched, and no one's going to believe that I'm going to blow up my grandmother. But, you know,
true.
She now has purpose.
Yeah.
Eric. I love my grandma. We all love our grandma.
We're writers.
That's part of what I think was the hard part of this pandemic. My stepfather ended up passing away 2 days after the earthquake here in Utah, and there's no way to go to funerals. There's no way to like comfort your grieving mother who's, right, 3,000 miles away because we couldn't travel and we were in quarantine. I think there's a lot of humanity to talk about when we knew that, that it was spreading, the way it was spreading, that it was spreading quickly. Those are the scientific things we learned. The fake news spread faster than the coronavirus. And there's a lot of different reactions we can talk about, but quarantine made things hard. And the fact that the elderly were dying divided a lot of our responses. I have a lot of family in New York. All of my elderly relatives live in New York. And I don't have any relatives living in Utah. And it was funny because I had people say, well, I just don't know anybody that's had coronavirus. And I was in a panic because the people that were most vulnerable to it were also in the hardest hit area of the country. And I'm out here where people are like not really taking it very seriously at all and really thinking that I'm overreacting and crazy, including my own teenagers who thought I was overreacting and crazy. And I was like, don't you love grandma? You need to love grandma. She's vulnerable. This is dangerous for our elderly. And so it was interesting, the societal reaction we had to that.
I agree. But Utah's reaction was extremely class-based.
It's true.
Because all the people that had jobs, which are usually good jobs, that amazingly they found out they could do at home because we now have widespread broadband. I mean, the moment and how we reacted, how everything happened is extremely specific to 2020. In 2010, it would have looked completely different because we wouldn't have had as much broadband and we wouldn't have had as much computer capacity. What we found is how many of our jobs you don't have to go to work for. They were all the good jobs, the crappy jobs, the low-class jobs. The people were the many minorities and people who already were in challenging healthcare situations. They're the ones that got hit early in Utah. And everyone's saying, when people are saying, I don't know anyone who's had coronavirus or anything like that, what they're saying is, my circle of friends are financially well off like me, and we don't, the subclass, the underclass, the working poor is not part of our horizon or part of our concerns.
The vulnerable population. We like to call it the vulnerable population of the state really was hit. 40,000 jobs lost in the first 6 weeks of the shutdown in Utah.
That's a lot. That's actually something I noticed. Oh, I nearly lost my job. I know something completely different because I live in the Northwest instead of Utah. The class system responded very differently depending on where you were. And I used Walmart as my basis because that's a thing that everybody goes to. And if I went to the upper class Walmart, they followed the rules way stricter than if I went to the lower class areas. The lower class were like, I don't want to even wear a mask. How dare you? And it was very much so. They were just like, listen, I've got to go to work. Shut up. Let me get to my stuff and let me get out. And it was really, do you remember the little lines, the little arrows in all the rows. And little German me was following those like the best I could, as you know. I was like, I must follow the rule. But my wife, who's from a different way of life, didn't even notice that there were lines and all those rules. And I was like, dear, can't you see these? We have to implement it this way, and then we swing around this way. We don't want to interrupt anybody. And she just did not see that at all, because we came from completely different steps in life. And honestly, I also noticed that rural areas didn't pay as much attention to the rules as much. If you're telling people, well, you can't go 20 feet outside of your house, the rural people are like, I'm still in my yard. It'll be like 2 miles before I actually get out of my yard. What do you mean I can only be that far out of my yard? Whereas if you're in Seattle, the rules were actually don't even open your door, order everything through Uber.
Yet who is
so much money?
Drivers? Who are these Uber drivers? Who are these people that cook anonymously in the background?
Yeah, those guys were probably super spreaders, but we had no idea. Okay, on to another question, and it's been brought up by your conversation as well. I noticed that schools started to go online, jobs started to go online, and a lot of that kind of stuff. To be honest with you, there have been people that have said, why haven't we been doing it this way since 2005? I actually have a friend. Go ahead.
Sorry. Finish your asking your question.
Okay. I've actually had a friend who was a principal of an online school in 2005, and he actually had to deal with teachers unions who said, we will never do this in our careers, and they actually tried to stop it from happening. So here we are, 2020, and now all the teachers are having to do this, and they're in a lot of trouble because many of them specifically tried to stop it from happening. So what are the changes that were supposed to happen and have happened because of COVID?
Yeah, one of the biggest things that COVID has taught us is the difference between can't and won't. So this call center that I worked at, it was federally funded and regulated. It was super strict. You couldn't have phones on the call floor. You couldn't have any recording devices. You couldn't have anything. There were a lot of rules, and everyone, when we would bring up work from home before COVID started, it was just not an option. It was not possible. And same thing with school testing. I was in college my last semester when COVID, everything moved online, and it was just, not possible. Students are going to cheat if they're at home and all this stuff. So when COVID hit and suddenly my call center was moving about half the people to work from home, it's like, wait a minute, you said we can't do this. So this external push was what defined the boundaries between can't and won't.
I'll say for the institution, coronavirus, we were already looking at more online classes and how to do things, but the number we throw around quite often is that the pandemic has pushed us ahead about 5 to 6 years in a matter of 3 months to 6 months. We moved 5 to 6 years in the future of online schooling and the ability to do streaming. And I don't know if everybody remembers this, but the whole Zoom bloom when everybody went to Zoom. And then Zoom was all over the news because somebody hacked into some elementary kid's class and he was doing a presentation, and then Zoom wasn't safe, and the scramble in technology was crazy. But online school has opened up a lot of possibilities, but there are a lot of students who have disappeared from the system completely. Families who are not even engaging with the education system anymore, who would have gone to school and gotten school lunch. I mean, across the country, I think our state actually did okay with the school lunch because they continued to give free lunch and they gave it to everybody. You just went by and picked up your lunch. But people depend on that to feed their children in again, it was that class system. If you had good Wi-Fi at home and you could join your classes and you had a parent who was home and could help you, you could maybe survive. But being, a working parent with now trying to graduate from middle school and high school again with my kids while they do online school, it's not easy. We lost Anne. So there's a large enough percentage of the population who just stopped sending their kids and stopped engaging, that we will see repercussions from this long term, from this year of the pandemic and year and a half, however long it lasts. There's going to be a lot of catch up we have to do in education, and particularly in those vulnerable populations who didn't have access to internet, didn't have educated parents, didn't have parents who speak the same language as their teachers. So while there were great increases in our technology and everybody was scrambling, and now Teams has all kinds of great things, and we could do this on Discord, we could do this on Google, we could do this on Teams. I have 6 different platforms I can do a Zoom or a call on virtually. But that's a privilege. That's an opportunity. That's because I have access through my job and other places. But there are a lot of people who are not engaging anymore and who are not getting the education they need, who are not learning how to read, who are not learning all of these things. And it'll be interesting to see, as we're living science in real time, we're living sociology in real time too. We're living history. And it's going to be interesting as all of the sciences study the repercussions of this pandemic and what advanced, where the winners were and who the losers were in business and science and industry and technology, and bureaucratic institutions like universities and others, hospitals and others, had to be nimble to survive. And our institution is nimble already and really gritty, but we jumped ahead because we were poised to respond, and it wasn't perfect. It was messy and fun and horrible and crazy and awesome, and everybody has an experience with it. I hate online school, but I love that my kids can go to school from home and I didn't have to send them.
I was profoundly grateful that all my children are adults. I really, really was. And as a teacher, I did the online stuff. I'd done online before. I was experienced with it. We had the infrastructure, and I had the similar experiences I had before. When you're teaching online, you're constantly trying to figure out how to compensate for the limitations of online that you can just naturally do the way that God intended teaching to happen, which is face-to-face. If I may be.
Professor.
Yes, Dr. Swedin.
I really enjoy teaching in class. I find teaching online unrewarding, and it is not as effective. Not as much learning happens. Not as much. There are advantages in terms of accessibility for some students, and I recognize those. But I just the biggest problem is when I'm talking to the class, it's so hard to get feedback for how the class is responding. Sort of like this panel right now, in which we assume there is an audience, and it may be one person, and it may be 0.
We assume we're not shouting to the void, but we don't know for sure.
It's a good thing it's a panel,
Hi,
so
void.
we're talking to each other. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox.
Oh, it's okay. I actually helped a university start an online program, and something. My wife is doing online school, and her school isn't even in our same state. And without online school, she wouldn't get her education. But it's been a really interesting thing because, like Eric, there's a lot of teachers out there who just assume that school can only be one way. And I've discussed this with many people. There's a university near us, but it's got its problems. I'll put it that way. It spent more money than it should have, and now it's in a lot of trouble because of COVID. And what I've noticed is when I interview students and I ask, okay, what do you want to get out of this education? one of the responses from them was, what was the point of that class? Couldn't I have learned that from YouTube videos and Wikipedia and stuff like that? Why did you have me take this class? And, that's a fascinating thing because of the online world and because of the COVID. There's a lot of people starting to ask that question. They're disappearing from the university system, but we don't know where they're going to end up. So, that actually, that's a good question. Where do you think we will be in about 2 years when supposedly COVID will be over?
Eric, you're muted.
I think you're muted, Eric.
Hey, now you really wound me up, Keith. There is a difference between vocational education and an education. And most people have no idea how to get an education. Because it's a lot more than an individual set of skills or an individual set of knowledge. Those things are fine when it comes to YouTube and all these other places. And I say this as a person who, quite frankly, almost everything that I know, I acquired through self-education. And I'm someone who has a PhD. I mean, obviously, along the way, I had a lot of education. But I look back at my education, and there are certain places that what the intellectual leap I needed to make happened because I was taking a class and I was learning things that must be learned and aren't fun, but provided the foundation to do the self-education. And so I will step off my soapbox again.
Well, and I'm going to say I think there are things that you can learn interactively online. I do some teaching. I love to teach. I love to teach in the classroom. I love to communicate with a live class. I was part of a leadership training that we had to move online that was transformational and very deep work that was accomplished online with very fantastic facilitation. They were all adult learners. So there's something to be said for that. Everybody came in with some idea of how to get the most out of it. But there are things that are hard. It's hard to learn soccer by watching a video. And it's hard to learn how to do bookbinding by watching a video. We were faced with hundreds of community ed classes, paint, photography, drawing, bookbinding, Dutch oven cooking. Like there was all kinds of things that are experiential learning things that are, you can't tell the temperature of your Dutch oven online. So a lot of people had to take responsibility for their own kind of experiential side of this. I have 2 kids taking online gym classes. I'm like, how's that going? It's just not the same thing as running with a whole group of people. So that's a part of education. Where do I think we'll be in 2 years? I think we will be surprised by the winners who came out of this pandemic. We'll be surprised by the opportunities that were created. We'll see new businesses. We'll see new models. I think delivery food will still be a thing because now people know you can just send an app text and they come in 10 minutes and my food's here. I think we'll see people emerging. We'll see some early adopters emerging, and we've already started to see that more congregations of people. But I do think that there will be people who just don't re-engage, even in 2 years, who have found a lot of anxiety in this time or convenience or don't need to go out of their houses as much. And so it will be very interesting as a society to see where we end up from here. My favorite my favorite kind of projection of where we will be was actually Tom Foolery's. I don't know if any of you watched it. It was The Great Realization. It was a video that circulated earlier in the year about all the things we learned. One of the things we didn't talk about is that the earth got better when everybody shut down, that water areas got cleaner, that trees came out, that the air cleared up over LA and Beijing and other areas. And they would have said this could never happen. And it happened in 2 weeks. And it didn't take long for the earth to recover. And so Tom Foolery did a children's story poem on YouTube about the Great Realization and all the things that we learn when we stop and reset the way we had to during this pandemic. It's been turned into a children's book. It's called The Great Realization. And it talks about how we came out. Some people will emerge with stronger families, stronger ties to family, better understanding of their neighbors and willingness to serve. And others will come out with, a care about how we protect the earth. Did we learn something from the pandemic? And if so, was it more than just being angry with each other? Was it more than just that we can work from home or that technology is an important tool? There are a lot of really fantastic lessons that have come out of the pandemic, and it's our job to use them and to spread them, to use them in our own lives, but also to immortalize them in story and character and other ways to really say, if you really reset society, what do you learn about yourself? And I think those are the things we're going to start realizing in 2 years.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of can't pushback. So going to the work from home or school from home, I think we're going to see, those are just a couple examples. When we have these limitations, we're going to see societally imposed. I think there's going to be more pushback. We're going to see more of this, well, can we really not do this? Well, I think it's possible. We clearly see that we've done this before. And I don't think we're going to accept absolutes as easily.
Thank you, everyone. That was really good. Looks like we've got 7 minutes left. Does anybody want to add anything that I haven't asked about?
We do have a few questions. One is from Stefan Fossman. And his question is: the South has regular hurricanes. Why are they handling the pandemic so badly?
I can answer that.
From the Red Cross, say one thing. We also had the most wildfires and the most hurricanes. This was not just a pandemic year. So you had to handle pandemics, hurricanes, wildfires. We outran the naming of hurricanes and we got into the Greek letters, if you remember that. I have a disaster map from August from the Red Cross, and I was like, I don't even know how we're going to get volunteers to all these things. There were wildfires going on, pandemic outbreaks, hurricane, a weird storm in Idaho.
Yep.
Yes, earthquakes.
Yeah. Eric looks like he was about to jump in and then went.
No, it's okay. Go ahead. Let's have some other questions.
Anne, do you have anything?
No, I think just what Donna was saying, we had a lot hit us. 2020 was the worst year and memed the worst year for pretty good reason.
I actually liked last year. I got married, so in the middle of the pandemic. I got divorced,
but other than that, it was great.
Congratulations to both of you.
Sunshine, sunset.
Do we have another question?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So Kiana Chase asked, how have your experiences during the pandemic affected your writing?
You'd think I would have gotten more of it done, but this is not the case.
I finally finished a project that's 2 years overdue. But since then, I've not been nearly as productive as I want to be, and it's really irritating.
I actually finished 2 novels this year, but I used my writing as my escape from all the craziness that's going on. So I had a good writing partner. I would say if you're struggling with accountability during the pandemic, find somebody who's in the trenches with you. I had a writing partner who was also wanting to write, and we kept each other accountable. And half our meeting was usually pandemic therapy, and then we wrote, and then we did sprints. It's important to have accountability in crazy times.
Are these therapy novels, though?
No, they're totally like a Regency romance and a YA empathy story. So it's hard to write an empath in the pandemic, by the way, because there's a lot going on.
Yep.
Yeah. As far as myself, I have not been able to return to Seattle or Portland, my homes. I've been staying in a place called Cheney. Usually I travel all over the Northwest going to conventions and helping people start arcades and stuff, and I have not been able to do a single one of those things and have had to reassess my money-making abilities. Also, my editor went through several problems. She went through a divorce, or she's going through a divorce, and other stuff. So she would send me like 40 pages and be like, that's all I could do. That's all I could mentally handle from all of this. So, everything got done in spurts.
Okay.
It's normal to feel pandemic fatigue too. It is harder to write this last month than it was even last year.
Yeah, I agree. I was most productive at the beginning when I thought it was going to be over in a couple of months.
Yeah.
15 days.
Yeah.
Do you have time for another question?
So, what do you think, or Max Florschutz asked, what do you think that U.S. society will learn from this, or is, or actually, well, or do you think that the U.S. society will learn from this, or is that being too positive? And there's a follow-up question by Wolfel Paul who said, what should or could the U.S. society learn from this as opposed to will?
Well, we've learned at least one thing, and it's that we have to retire the phrase, avoid it like the plague, because it turns out humans don't do that.
Well, not current humans. There's a wonderful story from the Middle Ages of a village in England that caught the Black Plague. And they basically put up signs at each end of the village said, "We have the plague." And they all stayed in the village and they let it rip through the village because they didn't want it to pass on to anyone else.
Mind you, the rest of England didn't do that. They continued trade.
Well, they did but you know what? The plague didn't pass on. It actually did stay confined. It's an amazing story, and it's a story of self-sacrifice and doing what's right for the broader group rather than as an individual. And very much of it came from the religious leadership that the town vicar provided. That really, it's a great story. Now, it's not the only type of story that happens, because people get terrified and they flee and they spread the disease.
Actually, speaking of the Black Plague, there was a time where everybody shut down, everybody stopped, everybody didn't know what to do, and there really was a decision on whether or not they were going to continue living after that. And it was difficult because continuing to live might mean you die. Whereas just letting yourself die, at least you have a choice in the matter. And that comes from many diaries we've read from people who just were trying to decide. And the Black Plague eventually went away. And they found that there were actually many blessings that they got from it. In the same way that suddenly we're all online and we're all getting all this technological improvement, they realized that they had oversaturated the market, or how do I put this? There were more workers than there were jobs for them. And now that there were less workers, everybody was living a lot better. And it's kind of joked that may have sparked the Renaissance, but let's not get into that part.
I think we're at time. Sorry.
Yeah,
we are at time. I think the United States could learn from their mistakes, what we didn't do right and what we did do right. And hopefully we'll learn to be a stronger society, because that's what adversity teaches us, how to come together and be stronger. That's what I hope.
I agree.